This story is related to the cursed depths of the Kalindi River and the skeletal secret it guards. The Kalindi River was not a mere body of water. It was a dark serpentine vein that bled through the heart of the northern plains, eventually merging with the holy Ganges. But unlike the life-giving Ganges, the Kalindi was whispered to be a harvester of souls. For decades, the river had claimed lives, fishermen who never returned, travelers whose boats capsized in perfectly still waters, and children who wandered too close to its muddy banks. The local administration had long turned a blind eye, dismissing the disappearances as tragic accidents caused by hidden whirlpools or stray crocodiles. However, the truth was far more predatory, lurking in the sunless silt of the riverbed. The silence was finally shattered on a scorching afternoon in June. Meera, the only daughter of the powerful village headman, Mukhya, had gone to the river with her friends to find respite from the heat. They chose a spot known as the Silent Bend, where the water looked deceptively calm, like a sheet of dark glass. Laughter echoed across the banks until a sudden chilling scream cut through the air. One moment Meera was splashing water at her friends, the next she was dragged downward with such violent force that she didn't even have time to gasp for air. Her friends watched in paralyzed horror as a trail of bubbles rose to the surface, followed by an eerie, absolute stillness. By evening, the village was in an uproar. The Mukhya, a man of immense influence, demanded immediate action. The local police was summoned, and with them came the first diver, a veteran named Raghav. Raghav had spent 20 years navigating the treacherous currents of the region, and he mocked the villagers' warnings about the river being hungry. "I've swum in the Ganges at midnight," Raghav boasted as he strapped on his oxygen tank. "A village river won't stop me." He dove into the black water as the sun began to set, casting a red hue over the Kalindi. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The rope attached to his waist, which was supposed to be his lifeline, suddenly went slack. The men on the shore pulled it back to find the end of the rope clean cut, as if severed by a razor-sharp tooth. Raghav never resurfaced. A cold dread settled over the crowd. The river had not just taken a girl, it had challenged the professionals. As the night deepened, the atmosphere turned funereal. Refusing to accept defeat, the Mukhya called in a specialized team of 5 deep-sea divers from the city, equipped with advanced underwater gear and powerful searchlights. By now, it was nearly midnight. The river looked like a void, a black hole carved into the earth. The team leader, a grim man named Vikram, sensed the unease. "Something is wrong down there," he whispered to his second-in-command. "The sonar is giving me readings that make no sense. It's showing structures or rib cages moving in the silt." But under pressure from the authorities, the 5 divers donned their suits and plunged into the abyss. They stayed connected via radio. For the first 5 minutes, the surface team heard rhythmic breathing and reports of heavy silt. Then the audio became distorted. There's something moving in the mud. Vikram's voice crackled over the radio, laced with a terror that froze the listener's blood. It's not a fish. Oh God, it's a hand. 100 hands. They're coming out of the... A collective scream erupted over the radio, followed by the sound of metal being crushed and a wet, tearing noise. Then, silence. 5 sets of high-end diving equipment, 5 lives, and 5 souls were extinguished in a single heartbeat. Not a single bubble rose to the surface. The news spread like wildfire. By the next afternoon, the incident had reached the highest levels of the state government. A massive military-grade operation was launched. 25 elite divers and several mini-submersibles were brought in. The riverbanks were lined with soldiers, searchlights, and grieving families. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a declaration of war against the unknown. The command was given: clear the bed, find everyone. The elite divers moved in a phalanx, their powerful lights cutting through the murky depths. As they reached the floor of the silent bend, they discovered a cavernous rift that hadn't appeared on any map. Inside the rift, the water was unnaturally clear, and what they saw made even the most hardened soldiers vomit in their masks. Thousands of skeletons were standing upright in the silt, their bony fingers interlocked to form a grotesque carpet of remains. In the center of this skeletal forest lay the bodies of those who had disappeared over the last 48 hours: Meera, Raghav, and the 5 city divers. But something was impossible. Though they had only been missing for hours, their flesh had been meticulously stripped away. They weren't fresh corpses, they were bleached white skeletons, looking as though they had been dead for centuries. Meera's skeletal hand was still clutching a gold bangle she had worn to the river. Raghav's skull was still encased in his diving mask, his jaw locked in an eternal, silent scream. The silent bend wasn't just water. It was an acidic supernatural entity that fed on the essence of time and flesh, aging its victims instantly to join its skeletal army. The divers retreated in a state of psychological collapse. The government, realizing they were dealing with a curse that couldn't be fought with steel or oxygen, ordered the silent bend to be permanently sealed. They used heavy machinery to drive a massive 20-foot iron spike into the river bank. On the spike, a heavy lead plate was bolted, engraved with a warning in 3 languages. To enter is to invite the ancient death. The silent bend does not release the living. The area was cordoned off with high fences and declared a forbidden zone. But as the years passed, the Kalindi River continued to flow, its dark waters whispering to the curious. Tourists and thrill seekers, unaware of the horror beneath the silt or arrogant enough to ignore the iron spike, still occasionally wander to the banks for a picnic or a swim. They see a peaceful river, unaware that beneath the surface, thousands of white skeletal hands are waiting, swaying with the current, ready to pull the next soul into a timeless grave. The tragedy of the Mukhia's daughter was just one chapter in the river's long, bloody history. The iron spike remains, now rusted and overgrown with weeds, a silent witness to the fact that some depths are not meant to be explored and some hungers can never be satisfied. The rusted iron spike, driven deep into the heart of the river bank, was never meant to be a mere marker. It was a seal, a divine gag placed upon the mouth of a subterranean nightmare. For 20 years, the leaden plate remained untouched, its warning fading under layers of moss and bird droppings. But curiosity is a disease that thrives in silence. A group of 5 college students, led by a reckless youth named Aryan, arrived at the forbidden banks of the Kalindi. They were armed with heavy-duty tools and a misplaced sense of bravery, intent on pulling the devil's nail to prove that the legends were nothing but old wives' tales. "Think about the views, guys," Aryan grinned, wielding a motorized winch. "The mystery of the silent bend debunked in 4K. As the winch groaned and the iron spike began to budge, the river itself seemed to react. The water, usually a murky brown, turned a bruised obsidian black. Bubbles, massive and smelling of ancient sulfur, broke the surface. With a final, violent metallic shriek, the 20-foot spike was ripped from the earth. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then a sound emerged from the hole left in the ground, a wet, sucking sound, like a giant gasping for air. From the river, a massive wave of black sludge rose, towering 10 feet high. It didn't splash, it moved like muscle. Inside the wave, thousands of white needle-like objects glistened. As the water receded, the students stood paralyzed. The silent bend was no longer silent. From the depths, the skeletal army began to climb. They didn't move like stiff corpses. They moved with a frantic insect-like speed. These were the divers, the villagers, and Mira, their bones fused together by a black sentient ichor that acted as their nervous system. Aryan's screams were the first to be silenced. A skeletal hand, still wearing the rotted remains of a diving glove, erupted from the mud beneath his feet. It didn't just pull him, it anchored itself into his ankle bone. Within seconds, dozen more hands emerged, stripping his clothes and skin with surgical precision. The ancient death mentioned on the plate was not a metaphor. It was a biological reset. The riverbed contained a prehistoric parasite, a colonial organism that lived within the calcium of bones. The students fled toward their jeep, but the ground itself had become a trap. The very silt they stood on was alive. Everywhere the iron spike had once exerted its pressure, the earth was now vomiting forth the remains of 1,000 years. One girl, Neha, tripped and fell into the shallow bank. Before she could even draw a breath to scream, the black water surged into her mouth. Her friends watched in clinical horror as her body began to convoke. Her skin turned gray, then translucent, and then it simply dissolved into the water like sugar. In less than 60 seconds, only her skeleton remained, bleached white and standing upright, its skull tilting toward the moon as it joined the ranks of the Kalindi's guardians. The horror escalated as the entities reached the village. This wasn't just a haunting anymore, it was an infestation. The acidic entity of the river began to seep into the local wells. That night, as people drank water or bathed, the transformation began inside their own homes. Families screamed as their flesh sloughed off their bones in the middle of dinner. The village of the Mukia, once a place of order, became a charnel house of clicking bones and liquid remains. The administration, alerted by the sudden loss of communication, sent in a tactical unit. They arrived to find a scene that defied human logic. The river had overflowed, but it wasn't water that filled the streets. It was a tide of skeletal remains, all moving in a singular, terrifying hive mind. The soldiers opened fire, but you cannot kill what is already dead. Bullets passed through rib cages, shattering bone, but the black ichor simply pulled the pieces back together, making the entities even more jagged and lethal. The commanding officer, seeing his men being dragged into the dark tide, realized the truth. The iron spike hadn't just been a warning, it had been an acupuncture needle for the earth, pinning a pocket of primordial void in place. By pulling it, the students had unzipped the reality of the valley. In the center of the river, a massive vortex formed. From its eye, a gargantuan figure emerged, a titan made of the fused bones of 10,000 victims. It was the king of the silt, the original deity the ancients had tried to imprison. It let out a sound that wasn't a roar, but the collective vibration of every bone in the valley. The vibration was so intense that the glass in the nearby town shattered, and the teeth of the living began to fall out of their gums.
Realizing that the infection would spread to the Ganges and then to the world, the government took the ultimate desperate step. They declared the entire district a zone of total obliteration. As the sun began to rise on the third day, the sky didn't bring light, but fire. Thermobaric bombs were dropped, incinerating the valley in a localized sun. The heat was so intense, it turned the river to steam and the bones to ash. When the fire died down, the Kalindi was gone. In its place was a blackened, glass-filled scar in the earth. The government built a concrete sarcophagus over the entire 10-mile stretch, hundreds of feet thick. They erased the village of Lower Konda and the Kalindi River from every map. They told the world it was a chemical spill, a tragic accident. But even today, beneath the millions of tons of concrete, the sensors occasionally pick up a sound. It's not a tremor or a shift in the earth. It is a rhythmic, metallic tapping. Clink, 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 as if something on the other side is trying to drive a spike back into the world. And sometimes, in the dead of night, the residents of the neighboring towns wake up to find a thin layer of fine white dust on their windowsills, dust that under a microscope looks suspiciously like pulverized human bone. The silent bend is gone, but the silence it left behind is the loudest thing in the world. For the river didn't die, it is simply waiting. For the concrete to crack, for the next generation to forget, and for the next hand to reach for the tool that will set the hunger free once again. The story of the Kalindi ends not with a funeral, but with a bated breath. For the earth remembers what the mind chooses to forget, that we are all just skeletons waiting for our skin to fail.